Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. Apologies. Do you mind if I steal that spot right there? Okay, thanks.
I think they have a spot.
You would think, I don't think it's straight is the only problem. I don't want to take any chances. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it. I'm going to provide a quick update on a few things, a little bit longer update on, I think, a fourth item. So I'm going to chat very briefly on the latest revenue forecast that came out yesterday. I do have an important update on our FEMA application, have some numbers around that, so I'll talk about that for a moment or two. Very brief update on issues moving through the legislature, but then I'll spend most of my time on the Millionaires Tax, and then, of course, happy to take questions. So on the revenue forecast that came out yesterday, that predicts our state will see an additional $827 million above the November forecast. That November forecast, as you know, is the one that I was required by law to utilize for proposing my budget. So in other words, the legislature has hundreds of millions of dollars to work with that I did not, so I'm a little jealous, but it's a good thing that they have that to work with. It's a challenging budget situation, and that will no doubt help solve some of the challenges that we're facing. Number two on that, which was also positive, is the council forecast an additional $1 billion, I think a little more than $1 billion in revenue for the 27-29 biennium. Obviously, positive development, and we're hopeful that that trend continues. So looking forward to continuing the work with the legislature to adopt a responsible and balanced budget. FEMA application. So today we're submitting our request to FEMA to declare a major disaster as a result of December's historic flooding and approve our state for the public assistance program. So the FEMA stuff can sometimes get a little confusing, but this is separate than the request we made I'm losing track of time, several weeks ago, a month ago, that was to assist individuals if their home, for example, was impacted by the floods. This is for infrastructure, this particular request. So the deadline for that's tomorrow. We're sending it in today. Part of that is, so we're asking for declaring a major disaster, and number two, to approve our state for a federal program called the Public Assistance Program. That program provides up to 75% reimbursement by the federal government for qualifying repairs to our infrastructure. So that would include the kind of things you'd expect: clearing debris, repairing damage to roads, bridges, public buildings, public utilities, water control facilities, parks, and more. So in terms of damage assessments that we are submitting to FEMA, this historic flooding resulted in, we believe, the largest dollar amount of public infrastructure damage in Washington State in more than 4 decades, and that's counting for inflation. So this is obviously a significant amount of money. The specific preliminary damage assessment that we're submitting is $182.3 million, 182.3. One thing I want to emphasize and underscore is this is a preliminary number. We have to meet a certain deadline for FEMA. So this number will increase as time goes on. This is very normal. So just as one example of many, we still have roads that are under snow, for example, that we still need to assess the total amount. Cost of repairs could increase as time goes on. So that number will change and will undoubtedly go up as time goes on. But the number that we're sending in is $182.3 million. We're also applying today for another FEMA program. This is called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is an important program that helps fund projects to prepare for future disasters. So, for example, building flood walls, for example. So the damage in many parts of our state, as I've mentioned many times, would have been even worse, significantly worse, without infrastructure to protect against the flooding. So it's just one example in Mount Vernon. We had a media event up there. A flood wall was recently constructed in Mount Vernon just in the last decade. It's clear that flood wall saved downtown from being flooded and saved an awful lot of pain and suffering cost to many Washingtonians. So if approved for that, Washington will qualify for grant funding up to 20% of our total damage assessment. Sorry for a lot of numbers, but in this case, that would be a maximum of $36.6 million. So in other words, 20% of our $182 million, that's what we can seek for that fund that helps us do preventative work going forward. So just wanted to be clear about that. We're also working with the Federal Highway Administration to get funding for repairs to highways in the state. This is a separate process from today's application. So the preliminary damage assessment total does not include, the $182 million does not include damage to federal highways or some of our state highways. So, for example, You're very familiar with Highway 2 and the impacts there, and undoubtedly the significant costs there. Our application, the $182 million, does not include Highway 2. So it's confusing on which ones are part of ours and which ones are not. These are just the rules that we're going by. If you have a question about a specific highway and you want to know if it's a part of our request or not, just ask Brianna. We can get that answered for you. And what I also mentioned is of the $182 million, the overall request we have, we are eligible for assistance of up to 75% of that number. That's the maximum that we can, if granted, that we can receive. So again, I realize I'm giving you a lot of numbers, but 182 is the request we have. We're eligible for 75% of that. So 25% will fall upon the state and local governments to cover, even if we're granted. I really appreciate the strong bipartisan support for this. I know there's a letter, once again, as there was for the previous request from bipartisan leadership in the state legislature. We have a similar request for a letter from our congressional delegation. They did that last time. I'm optimistic they'll do that again. Business community is writing letters, Association of Cities. There's just a lot of strong support for this. So I feel we're really putting our best foot forward. And I'll be working hard to make sure that we receive the dollars that we desperately need to really address the significant infrastructure needs that we're facing. Today, as you know, is the House of Origin cutoff for the legislature. I'm pleased that we have 6 bills that are agency requests from my office. All 6 have survived and passed their House of Origin, most of those with bipartisan support. So we thank all of our sponsors and prime sponsors, Debbie, of course, in particular, for all the hard work on that. Getting any bill to survive at this stage is a challenge, as you know. So all 6 are alive, so we appreciate that. I won't go through those all in detail. We're happy to get more information for you, but those bills continue our efforts, for example, to speed up and reform our permitting and licensing process, make it easier to build more housing, and protect kids from the dangers of AI chatbots. I will focus the remainder of my time on one piece of legislation, which is getting a lot of attention, of course, the Millionaires Tax. So my team and I are continuing to have productive conversations and discussions with legislative leaders on this proposal and how we can make our state more affordable. And the Senate came out with a good start on how we can utilize the revenue from that Millionaires Tax. As a reminder, we're talking about a tax on incomes over $1 million. I'm probably asked just about every day when I'm out in public, does that count the first $1 million that somebody has in their income? The answer is no. So if you make $1.2 million, if you're fortunate enough to be in that category, you are taxed on $200,000, right? The $200,000 above the $1 million. It does not count the value of your home, right? A lot of folks have homes that are worth a fair amount of money just given the housing market, but that value does not count to the $1 million, just so we're clear. So, or your retirement savings. I've said multiple times that any bill I sign must send a significant percentage of the revenue back to Washington families and small business owners. We are not there yet, and we are still not close to being there. This bill must be laser focused on making life more affordable for Washingtonians and continuing to improve areas like K-12 education. Now that we have a Senate proposal, we'll of course soon have a House proposal, so I'm going to lay out in a bit more detail my proposal for how to utilize the revenue from the Millionaires Tax. I'm going to focus, just to be clear, I'm going to focus on the part of the revenue that would go directly back to Washingtonians, okay, just to be clear of what I'll be focused on. So first, we need to make life more affordable for small business owners. I think there's a front page article in the Seattle Times, I think the Sunday edition, if I recall correctly, that was all about small businesses. I think one nearby to where we are right now that's going through a tough time to make ends meet with additional taxes and costs and things going up. So as I've said before, we need to go much bigger to assist small business owners who help power our economy and create jobs. We should use $1 billion of this new revenue to give small business owners a significant, and that's an understatement, tax break. That means dramatically increasing the small business tax credit, which effectively wipes out B&O tax on the first $2.5 million in total revenue for that business. So just to put a number on that, if adopted, that would result in 170,000 small businesses in Washington State no longer paying the B&O tax, zero. Another 30,000 businesses would have their B&O tax reduced. This approach, if adopted, saves these businesses an average of about $5,000 every year. So I appreciate the first step in the Senate proposal to approve a credit up to $300,000 for small businesses, but we need to do more. I also really appreciate Senator Elias's amendment just late yesterday afternoon that eliminates the sales tax on a number of services, which will likely help, well, not likely, it will help businesses, nonprofits, and school districts all across our state. That's rolling back a tax that was adopted last year. Second thing I want to focus on, the Working Families Tax Credit, which I've talked about a fair amount. This is an existing program we have in the state of Washington in which approximately 350,000 low-income families qualify and receive a check, a rebate from the state of Washington for an amount between $300 and $1,300, depending on their income, the size of their family, that type of thing. It's a great program, but it needs to live up to its name of being the Working Families Tax Credit, because right now, far too many working families, they don't qualify for it. So we must dramatically expand both how many working families qualify and the amount of money that they receive. And I need to see both of those things for any bill that I'd be signing. There are simply too many working families who don't qualify. I'll give you a couple examples. A married couple in Bothell raising 2 kids. One's a bus driver, one is a line cook. Assuming they both make typical wages for those professions, they have a take-home pay of about $65,000, and they would not qualify for the Working Families Tax Credit. They would just miss it. Another example, a single parent in Yakima raising 2 kids on their own, working as a custodian. Assuming typical wages, including some overtime every week, they might bring home around $57,000 each year. Once again, that individual with those 2 kids does not currently qualify for a Working Families Tax Credit. I can assure you, those are working families. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of families just like that all across our state who are working very hard who do not qualify for this really wonderful program. So here's the way that I look at it. Washington State has what's called a needs standard. A needs standard is a number already set by the state. DSHS establishes this for different programs, and it provides an estimate of what a household needs to maintain a basic standard of living in Washington State. It includes things you would expect: food, clothing, shelter, energy costs, transportation, other necessities. Think of it as a household's living wage. That's a reasonable standard, in my view, to use to figure out who needs some assistance to help make their life a little bit more affordable here in Washington State. So I propose raising eligibility for the Working Families Tax Credit so every Washington family earning at or below that needs standard would qualify. That makes sense to me. Those are our working families, and we need to do this. It will require an investment of $180 million. To me, that is a bargain when we are bringing in a millionaire's tax revenue of over $3 billion. To give you a sense of how many households would be impacted, 460,000 additional households would qualify for assistance from the Working Families Tax Credit if we do this. So we should also increase, by the way, the amount that we send in terms of the rebate. And my proposal increases the amount by 30%. All this combined would make a real difference for those hundreds of thousands of working families all across our state. My total proposed increases, put a dollar amount on this, in the Working Families Tax Credit would include the elimination of the age restriction, which was approved by the Senate, which I really appreciate. So they've done that in their proposal. They eliminated the age restriction in the Working Families Tax Credit. So that, combined with significantly increasing eligibility for nearly 500,000 working family households and increasing the amount of the rebate by 30%, all of that totals $380 million. That's an annual number once this thing is up and running. Our North Star, as I've said before, and I will say it again, is to make life more affordable for more Washingtonians, and this is a key tool in achieving that important goal. As a side note, I just want to be really clear. It's important to clarify what the Senate proposal does on the Working Families Tax Credit. They, of course, eliminated the age restriction, which I support. They also set aside about $300 million each year. What that is that's paying for the existing program. That $300 million is being paid for right now. So they would essentially use the millionaire's tax to backfill that $300 million. That's an okay idea, but that does not count as new dollars back in the pockets of Washingtonians. So I just want to be clear. What I'm proposing is new dollars back in, expanding eligibility. What they have done is simply backfilled existing investments that we're making in that program into the millionaire's tax. We also need more sales tax relief. Sales tax hits Washingtonians hard because it's the same for everybody, regardless of your ability to afford it and pay for it. We all have essentials we need to purchase. So I'm proposing the following. First, let's create a sales tax holiday. 18 states do this already, where for a limited period of time, people can buy certain items without paying any sales tax at all. A sales tax holiday is understood by the public and would apply to all Washingtonians. My proposal includes 2 sales tax holidays, one 3-day weekend, one 2-day holiday. During that time, there'd be no sales tax on items less than $1,000. That would put approximately $141 million back in the pockets of Washingtonians every single year. So for example, what some states do is they have a weekend holiday before school starts. So parents who need to buy school supplies for their kids, buy clothes for their kids, they can do that and save a lot of money at the same time. I also propose making certain products exempt from the sales tax every day of the year. And I support the Senate proposal to exempt hygiene products. Let's also add the following items. All diapers, and baby products should be exempt from the sales tax. That costs about $200 million every year. In total, adding this all up, my proposal puts, of all the revenue that would come in from the Millionaires Tax, it will put $1.9 billion, a little less than that, but about $1.9 billion directly back in the pockets of Washingtonians. It's over half of the total revenue generated. So all that said, and before I take your questions, I look forward to, of course, working with the Senate, the House, as we arrive at an outcome that works for all of us and get to a place that it's a bill that I can sign. The key word in this whole operation is affordability. That is going to be what guides me. What I'll be looking for in proposals is making life more affordable for Washingtonians and supporting core programs like K through 12 education in our state. And it's not doing that is something I'll be extremely skeptical of. And so just really appreciate the partnership. We've had a lot of conversations with legislative leaders. The team's had many more, and look forward to more of those conversations as we try and bring this in for a landing in the final weeks of the session. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that folks have.
Governor, if the changes aren't made, would you veto the Millionaires?
Oh, I'm not going to get into a hypothetical. I mean, I think I've been pretty clear. I think where I've used the word must, and so I think that's being heard. And look, anything we do around here, you've got to compromise, right? I get that. I think the House gets that. I think the Senate gets that. But I just want to be super clear. I've been clear in private conversations, want to be clear to the public about what I need to see in that to support it. So do I support the concept of Millionaires Tax? You better believe it. Absolutely. But, and this is a significant but, it just can't be $3.5 billion that goes into our general fund. That's not going to work. We know life is too expensive for too many Washingtonians, right? That's a fact. And I hear that every single day when I'm out in public. I hear that from small businesses when I'm out there in public. And we need to be laser focused on making life more affordable for them. So I understand there's lots of competing pressures on how to utilize billions of dollars of revenue. I do. But we need to make a significant investment in that. And I think that's what the people want to see. And it's not just taxing the wealthy, right? It's taking a significant amount of those dollars and helping out folks at the other end of the economic ladder. And that's something I feel very strongly about.
There's
Yeah.
been a lot of concern for folks that are worried that this is going to trickle down, that there should be an income tax on all of us. You've been kind of careful with some of your language to not say that you want that included in the bill that you would sign, that that's not going to be necessary. Would you be willing to state that you don't want this to trickle down beyond a tax on millionaires?
Sorry, I've been careful about what?
Would you be willing to say on the record that...
What do you said I was careful about something. What am I being careful about?
I asked you before, about this trickling down to lower incomes, and I think your response was to say that for now we're just talking about the Millionaires Tax. We're not talking about...
I've been crystal clear on that for anyone who's been listening. So my position is clear, that the Millionaires Tax should only apply to folks who make that $1 million. And I've also said there needs to be essentially an inflation index, so that amount goes up every single year. So it doesn't essentially folks don't essentially come up to it eventually. So I've been crystal clear on that, that's what I support, and I would not be signing a tax that tax folks below the $1 million. So I've been very clear about
Even
that.
in the future?
I've been very clear about that, yes. Drew?
I was going to ask the same question, took care of that one.
Good.
Not to get away from the millionaire's tax, but there are lots of taxes that are being looked at for this budget, this supplemental budget, increasing the cigarette tax, bottle bill, still being discussed. Where do you stand on those issues? How much new revenue do you think needs to be part of this supplemental budget?
Well, we're having conversations. I mean, I was pretty clear in my proposal that did not have the benefit of the extra hundreds of millions of dollars that the legislature has, that did not raise those taxes, right? And so what I would say, to the public is, and my team knows this in conversations I have with them about proposals, is I'm pretty laser focused on is something increasing cost to Washingtonians. And if so, there better be a pretty damn compelling case for doing that, okay? So I was able to propose a budget that was not easy by any stretch, that had hundreds of millions of dollars less than the legislature but it balanced and did not raise taxes. So that gives you a sense of how I'm approaching this and how I'll continue to look at it going forward. Yeah, let's go. We'll move it back and move forward. Yeah.
Governor, whenever the income tax proposal was still in Senate Ways and Means, So what does that say to you, and what would your message to Washingtonians with concerns about the proposal be?
Well, I hear concerns of any Washingtonian concerned with any tax increase. So I think what I would say is those of us who support the concept of millionaires tax need to be really, really clear that it applies to less than 0.5% of Washingtonians, right? And I've not said that today, and I should have said that today, right? Like I should have done that, right? Been crystal clear about that. That is something we need to emphasize so the public understands who this applies to. And to the earlier question, to be also clear, it's $1 million and it goes up with inflation every single year after that, to be equally clear about that. And to be clear about where the money goes. I don't think the public would support a millionaire's tax if the money simply got deposited in the state general fund without significant dollars going back to the people, right? You know, it's not, again, just about taxing the wealthy. It's about making life more affordable for Washingtonians. So that's part of this process, is to speak publicly about this and be really clear about what it is, who would pay it, who would not pay it, what doesn't count. Your house doesn't count. Your retirement savings don't count. I had a conversation yesterday with someone who thought that the house did apply. And I said, no, it does not. You know, double check with my team afterwards to make sure. So part of that is part of a public conversation. That said, I'm not a big poll guy, you know, but obviously I've seen polling around a millionaire's tax, and, you know, I wouldn't be supporting if I didn't think it would survive at the ballot box. So the people will ultimately have their say on this. That's something else I would say to individuals. They're going to have their say on this. If this passes legislature, if it survives a court challenge, undoubtedly the voters will have their opportunity to weigh in, as they should. I support that. I tend to be a supporter of the initiative process, and this is a big proposal, and I'm glad they'll have a chance to weigh in. So at that time as well, it'll be incumbent on folks like me, if we go forward, to be really clear with the public of who's paying it and who's not. And I think when the public hears that, if we're able to get to a place that I support, I think that they will see a proposal that applies to only a very, very small number of Washingtonians and literally helps millions of Washingtonians all across our state. Yeah.
On the revenue forecast,
Yeah.
does that change your calculus or stance on tapping the rainy day fund or tapping the CCA for the Millionaires Tax credit, or you still want to see that?
I guess what I'd say, look, the legislature is working hard right now, so I don't want to, I guess all I would say is, and they've still got hard decisions to make, even with the extra hundreds of millions of dollars that they have. And different folks might reasonably use those dollars in different ways. So, I want to be flexible on that and understand, hey, there were cuts I made in my budget that if I'd had an extra $600 or $700 million, I probably wouldn't have made. Maybe I would have had taken less out of rainy day reserve fund. I didn't have that situation, so I don't know the answer to that question. But we're working together. We're having those conversations, and I'm confident we'll arrive in a place that that balances out all those things. Yeah.
There's at least 3 significant tax rollbacks that are in play right now. There's the latest amendment you
Yep.
mentioned, the rollback to retail sales tax on services.
Yes.
There was the bill passed yesterday to roll back changes to the
State
estate tax.
so I support that.
And then there's also the rollback of the early expiration provision of the
Yes.
P&O surcharge that's embedded in the income tax bill.
And that's like in the first year or two of the millionaires. Yep. And I support that as well. Yeah.
Okay, so you said that was the first part of
Yep.
the question. You support all 3 of those rollbacks.
Yes.
You're talking about spending $2 billion of the roughly $3.5
Mhm.
billion that would come in per year from the income tax. I mean, I guess you worry, you came into office at a time of budget stress. You
Yeah.
worry that by rolling back these taxes that lawmakers are talking about rolling back now, you're talking about spending $2 billion of $3.5 billion.
Yeah.
But the state ends up on a trajectory where you're still in, dicey financial terrain a few years
Yeah.
from now.
We talk a lot about that. What I would say I worry most about is making life more affordable for more Washingtonians. That's what I worry most about. I think we've made a lot of progress in the last year of aligning our budget to reality. We no longer assume the 4.5% revenue growth, but we've talked about before that state law allows the legislature to assume in doing a budget, even though that's not grounded in any reality. We now budget to our actual revenue forecast, and that's going to be the case as long as I'm governor. I feel optimistic about the trends that we're seeing with the latest revenue forecast. That said, there's still challenging issues, but look, it's a balance. That's why there's a debate going on, right? That's why I don't agree with every legislator, and they don't agree with me on exactly how to balance this. If we've got 50 people in this room, I guarantee you, if you all were to craft how to allocate $3.5 billion, you'd have 50 different proposals. I guarantee it. No two would be exactly alike, for sure. So that's just a part of the process. What I need to do is advocate what I feel strongly about and what I see when I'm out there traveling the state. And, for businesses and for Washingtonians who are struggling right now, we need to meet the moment with this opportunity and make sure that we're putting a significant amount of the revenue back in their pockets. So I hear that concern, and we're talking about that. Yes?
Going back to the FEMA assistance
Mhm.
request, do you have an estimate at all for when you might get a response to either of those, either the one you're submitting today or the one you submitted a few
Yeah,
years ago?
great question on timing for FEMA. I don't really. And so, if we get some sense of that, of course, we'll let you know. But that's really up to FEMA and the federal government. Look, we understand that, it's I don't know how many pages our last two requests are, but they're lengthy documents, they're detailed, there's a lot of data, there's a process. We understand that. So we understand they have a process to go through, but if we get any information, we'll let you know. Yeah, yes.
Is there any reason to be concerned that the federal government would approve the reimbursements?
Is there any reason for concern they might not grant it? Well, of course. I mean, it's you read the same news stories I do, that when it comes to disasters, that requests that in the past would have been, to be candid, routinely granted. That's not the case anymore. That's not a political statement. That's just a reality statement. And so I just need to live in the world of reality. So to answer your question, of course I'm concerned, and that is why we are working extremely hard to provide as much information as possible. And also, I'll emphasize, it's not just my voice making the ask, right? I appreciate the bipartisan support for this, which I mentioned before. And the business community getting engaged, and cities and local mayors, and it's been those voices will make a big difference. The video that we did, which amplifies different voices of people impacted individually by the flood, that's a video we've sent to the federal government and to FEMA. So they're not just reading words and charts on a piece of paper, but they're actually seeing images that many of you compiled, by the way, which I appreciate, the media did through the flood, so that folks back in Washington, D.C. Can actually see visually the harm here. So I'm concerned, but I'm optimistic. I think our case is extremely compelling, to put it mildly. It's a historic flood, and I just really appreciate the hard work of my team, cities, a lot of folks put a lot of work into this, and so I'm optimistic. Yeah. I'll come back around, yeah.
If the millionaires tax were not passed,
Yeah.
do you have an alternative plan for how to address affordability for Washingtonians?
Well, there's lots. Thanks for that question. There's lots we need to do on affordability. This session, there are various bills that address that, by the way. But that said, it's a short session's challenge for any bills, I've said before, but I remain optimistic that we'll get this millionaires tax done. Of course, it's not a guarantee. It's complicated. There's a lot going on, but there's a lot of effort going into it. And while we may not be exactly on the same page yet on some key details, I think there's still plenty of time, and I think we all come from a place of wanting to be thoughtful about this. So I feel optimistic. Happy to answer that question again if we don't get it done, but I remain optimistic that we'll get there on the millionaires tax. I do. Yeah. So I'll come back around. Yeah. Go ahead. I'll come back next.
Critics have definitely suggested that this tax would prompt high earners and corporations to the state. What evidence have you seen that either supports that or refutes that?
I've not seen evidence of that. There's anecdotal things I've read in the newspapers, and I've also read Danny Westneat's article recently about the city of Seattle, where I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, so apologies to Danny, but the amount that was projected for the revenue, right, in Seattle for a tax they had that impacted folks, the amount that they actually achieved for high earners exceeded fairly dramatically, right? So, it's like anything. We just need to be thoughtful about all of our taxes, which is why I appreciate Marco Elias's rolling back a significant tax from last session. And the question earlier about the estate tax, I appreciate the Senate rolling that back. Like these things are all, I realize I'm focused on the millionaires tax here, but of course we look at everything in totality because all of these things impact a business or impact an individual, right? I don't think it's any one is my feeling. It's not just my feeling, I should be more specific. That's not what I hear when I have conversations, for example, with businesses who come and meet with me on a fairly regular basis, right? It's pretty rare, if ever, I hear this one thing is make or break for us. I think what the concern I hear is the totality. Gas taxes, to put it all together, what that means for us. So that's how I look at it, is trying to balance all those things, which is why I appreciate the rolling back of some taxes. I think that's helpful. I think that sends the right message to individuals and businesses across our state. Yeah.
Governor, exactly 1 year ago today, you halted the automatic destruction of Teams messages at state agencies and said you'd be conducting a 6-month evaluation. Can you share any details of what the evaluation from that found, and has the automatic destruction of records resumed since then?
So I'll have my team get back to you, just so I don't want to get that wrong, but Brianna's happy to follow up right afterwards. Yeah.
I've spoken with several small business owners whose businesses fall under the pass-through entities, and so they're concerned that they're going to be negatively affected by the millionaire's tax because of the household income and their small business income will all total over $1 million. Can you please speak to them?
Well, what I would say, if you're a small business, under my proposal, you're going to be receiving a massive tax break, right? And so, if you're an individual making over $1 million, you're going to be paying that, right? So there are less than 0.5% of Washingtonians who will pay it. So that's reality for those 0.5% of Washingtonians, right? They'd be paying on income above $1 million, not their first million, the income above that. So what I would say to folks who would be required to pay it is, I think we all believe in a state that has a workforce where folks can afford to live in our state, have housing in our state, pay for basic necessities. And yet we have a state where hundreds of thousands of households don't meet what the state defines as basic needs, okay? And so I think all Washingtonians support a state, the values of our state, of helping out folks meet those basic needs. That's good for our state, it's good for our economy, it's good for businesses. These are people, they're working families. By definition, they're working in those businesses. And so that's what I would say to those folks. Maybe one or two more? Yeah.
On the FEMA issue, you talked about the Federal Highway Administration being a separate avenue for
Yeah.
some federal and state highways. Is there a sense of the damage estimate there to those, including US2, or what you're going to be seeing?
We don't have that number yet, and so I asked him that earlier, and so no, it's too soon for that. But as soon as we get it, we know there's intense interest in this, which is why I'm bringing it up today. So as soon as we have a number, we just don't want to get numbers that are preliminary or aren't quite right. It's extremely important that we communicate accurate information, obviously to the federal government, to FEMA at the right time. But once we have that, I'm sure I'll be back here at this podium and sharing that with you again. Yeah, let's do a couple more. Go for it.
So there's been a debate surrounding what critics are calling the marriage penalty in the income tax.
Yeah.
Such concerns are about whether it might push some couples to leave or potentially even divorce. So how would you respond to those concerns, and do you support applying the tax to married couples with a combined income of over $1 million?
Yeah, as I understand, that's a proposal now, and that's one that I support. And look, again, I don't want to repeat myself. It's going to apply to 1% of Washingtonians, right? So that would be reality for those folks whose income exceeds $1 million, even as a couple. So we, of course, would be watching closely. And it's not just for millionaires tax. To the question earlier, the combination of our taxes from Washington State, that's important to me, and what those impacts are for individuals and for businesses. So what I'm looking for is what we're doing with this tax, but also the rolling back of other taxes is a very important component of the whole puzzle that's going on. And so what we're trying to do is balance all that out, right? Roll back some taxes, tax break for businesses, but for 0.5% of Washingtonians, yes, they'd be paying more. Yeah.
The three tax rollbacks that we were discussing earlier, I mean, those are all taxes you signed into law last year.
Correct.
So by supporting rolling back those taxes now, I mean, is that an acknowledgement on your part that that tax package, that those taxes were constructed poorly, that they went too far, or is it just that the situation has changed now that the income tax is in play?
I mean, I've spoken about this before. I think what I would say is, I just speak from my perspective, right, that, as you know, the $16 billion budget shortfall, that was made public shortly after I got elected governor. It wasn't like we had a year to prepare for this, right? That wasn't a public conversation before I ran for governor for a year and a half, and no one ever mentioned the words budget shortfall. And the entire time I ran for governor, it wasn't ever an issue. Wasn't part of the conversation literally at all in any debate or anything. So shortly after getting elected, it came out that there was this massive budget shortfall. So look, do I think there's been a recognition that, hey, some of those went too far and to be rolled back? Absolutely. But I would just say, to place in some context of having in a very short period of time, the legislature having to balance a budget that involved billions of dollars in cuts to our budget, which was a lengthy, time-consuming, and difficult process, and trying to balance out with some revenue and trying to do that in a thoughtful way in a session is, not an easy assignment. So, look, I appreciate anyone, a legislature, a governor, a reporter, anyone who says, hey, you know what, did this, you know what, these things weren't quite what we intended. Maybe these impacts weren't quite what we intended. We need to change that. I think the public appreciates that if elected officials say, you know what, we didn't do that quite right. We're going to go back and do it a little bit differently. And the other thing I'll say is hearing the concerns that were expressed by individuals and businesses. That's a big part of conversations I've had is folks saying, hey, this one impacts in this way. This tax impacts school districts, impacts governments. So I think there is a recognition by the legislature that we needed to change that, and I appreciate the fact that folks are open to that. All right, last one. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, any comments or responses to the fact that a lot of these, I mean, all of these proposed relief efforts are not really gonna take effect until 2029? You know, do you think that there are any parts of this bill that could be pulled out and implemented sooner than 2029, or is 2029 really that earliest start?
You're talking the millionaire's tax?
Yeah.
Well, we can't, just to be clear, we can't pull out, as much as I support expanding access to the working families tax credit, for example, right? We can't do that until, A, we're able to set up a system to collect the revenue, and it survives the court challenge and survives the court of public opinion. In other words, I don't support spending money we don't have right now. I don't support that. And so, to me, we have to do this in a way that's thoughtful and careful, and we've got to set up a system to do this. Most states have a tax like that in some form. We don't. So we have to set up a system to do that. And we need to make sure we're doing that correctly and thoughtfully. So certain things take time. I've asked the team, hey, are there things we can do to accelerate that? Of course. But it's going to take the time that it's going to take. On the other hand, if adopted and signed into law, there will be a court challenge. That will take some time. There will be a challenge to it at the ballot box. That will take some time. So in some respects, that's just as well, right? We have to get through those two hurdles as well before it's revenue that we can rely upon to do good things on behalf of the people, do good things on behalf of our education system, and all that. So thanks again so much for all the questions, everybody. Hope you have a great day. Thanks again. Appreciate it.